Hello and welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to be playing a couple of different games against players in the rating range of 2100 plus in chess.com's Rapid Chess Pool. We're going to be playing games focusing on the French defense repertoire that I have recommended in a Chessable course. This is not necessarily part of the speedrun series that I've already done here on chess.com. However, it is going to be just additional instructive games focusing on this repertoire. With that in mind, on Chessable right now, they are running a sale going through the rest of the year at the end of 2024. If you're interested in checking out the French Defense Chessable course, I would recommend this is kind of the time to go check it out and take a look, since there is a discount, and that's going to give you the chance to get something, for the holidays or for the end of the year. I would recommend that. So with that being said, let's jump right into the games. We'll get into our first game here in just a second. All right, game number one here. Playing against our knight at the Opera, rated 2141, e4, e6, d4, d5 with our French defense. Our opponent goes for knight to d2 with the Tarrasch variation. We're going to trade pawns on e4 and then go for our Fort Knox maneuver, bishop d7 to c6 to attack the knight on the e4 square. And we'll see what our opponent does about this. Knight f3 is one of the main moves. We go bishop c6 to attack the knight. Then we play the move knight to d7 before we play knight to f6. You don't want to start with knight to f6 because after knight takes f6, we cannot recapture with the queen without running into some tactical problems. I've talked about this in other episodes of the speedrun series. Again, this isn't a episode of the speedrun series, but if you're wanting to get maybe a little more in-depth information on the opening, you can check out some of those other episodes that'll be linked at the end of the video. So here we go for knight to d7 first. Then we'll play knight f6 afterwards, most likely. And then that way, if white takes, we can recapture with the knight or the queen. Kind of depends a bit on the situation. Okay, so white goes for the move pawn to c3, which is an interesting option here. We have to be a bit careful against this particular move. The idea with pawn to c3 is that if we go for the move knight f6 now, and white takes, and we take back with the queen, it doesn't work to do this because now the pawn on d4 is defended. White would still play bishop g5 attacking our queen. We could try to eliminate the knight on f3, but then they play queen to d2, and we don't have the option of queen takes d4. Queen takes d4 would have worked if the pawn wasn't there on c3, because there is no bishop to b5 check with our knight on d7. A little bit convoluted explanation, but essentially suffice it to say, if we go knight f6 and they take, we cannot recapture with the queen in this variation because we would get it trapped. So we're still going to go for knight f6, but after knight takes f6, we are going to recapture with the knight instead. It is not the optimal setup in the grand scheme of things, but that being said, it is a solid setup nonetheless, and we'll be able to work around the different ideas there. So we'll still go knight f6. I'm assuming white will take. I'm not entirely sure if they will. Okay, so we're taking back with the knight. White's most likely going to castle. If they move the knight off of f3, we will take the pawn on g2. They play bishop f4. This is another option that's available to them. One of the drawbacks of the bishop going to the f4 square is it does allow us at the right time to play the move knight to d5 to harass the bishop. We also have the option of playing bishop to d6 just to offer a trade of pieces. This is also a perfectly good way of playing. We can even play a little more, let's say, ambitiously and keep more pieces on the board if we want to play a move like just bishop e7 here. So let's see. If we go bishop e7, white castles, we castle. They will then be able to play the move knight to e5. And that becomes a little bit annoying because our knight is not, our bishop on c6 doesn't have a ton of squares available. I think what I will do in this case is actually go for the bishop d6 move, just to offer the exchange. And if white takes, I think I will probably recapture with the pawn. I think another option here, in hindsight, is we could even decide to play bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and then queen to d5. I think this is another option that's available as well. Trying to exchange some pieces, chase some trades. It doesn't work so great here, though, I think, because there is pressure on the c7 pawn. And if our queen moves too far away from it, then we would end up losing the pawn. So I'm just going to go for bishop d6. He does play knight to e5, and he is putting pressure on the c6 bishop. It is a little bit different here once we've developed the f8 bishop, because if we take on g2 and white moves the rook away, once our bishop does retreat, then they will be able to take the pawn on g7, which is not really a fantastic situation for us. So with that in mind, I'm going to first take the knight on d6, with the assumption that white's going to recapture with the bishop, probably. But then I think we can work. I think we can work around that. I believe. I think he's going to take with the bishop. If he takes with the pawn, I can play something like knight to d5. He does take with the bishop. Now, if I take the pawn on g2 and the rook goes to g1, I do have the move queen to d5 to reinforce that bishop. If he plays pawn to c4, attacking my queen, that could get a little bit annoying, I will say. Maybe queen a5 check, he blocks, we trade queens, my bishop is still being attacked, behind it is that pawn on g2, or is that pawn on g7. So against this particular move order, I think I might even begin with queen to d5 right at the start. This is an option that's available. It would probably encourage white to play a move like pawn f3, because the pressure on the g2 pawn is quite annoying. And if they play a move like pawn f3, then that's always going to give them some drawbacks to the position. There's always going to be some kind of problems with those situations. So I think I will throw this in. I'm not actually sure if this is the best move or not. I am a little bit on my own at this point. He does play f3. Now he is threatening to potentially take the pawn on g7, or on c7 here. I'm not sure if that is the biggest deal in the world right now, but nonetheless, I don't know if I want to allow that capture to happen for free. Maybe here I can play something just like rook to c8 to guard the pawn. I don't really mind too much if they capture on f6. I am happy to have encouraged the move f3, which does weaken the king side slightly. I can also just bring the queen back to d7 if I want to do that as well, or back to d8. Let's see here. The game plan in the long run is to play something like b6, move the bishop back, and then play c5. So with that in mind, a rook on c8 is really not that bad of a situation for us, I think. So I'll probably just go ahead and play rook c8 here. And then probably I'll castle. And once again, I'm not terribly worried about black taking on f6. Even though my king would be a little more exposed, no question about it. I don't think white has the firepower to really stir up too much of an attack. What I do want to do, though, is probably castle, b6, bishop, b7, c5. I definitely want to get this c5 move in, because at the moment, white has no real problems with their center. Objectively speaking, white's probably a little bit better off here. They have the pair of bishops and a little more space, but our pieces are solid. The f3 move is something that will bother white in some ways. If they castle, I would like to play knight g4, taking advantage of the pin. However, if I go knight g4, there is the move bishop to e4, which is pretty concerning, you could say. So that kind of prevents that particular idea. I would assume he's going to castle. I don't know if he's going to move the queen and castle queenside. That's a little bit risky, since the a2 pawn will always be a potential target. So let's see what white decides to do. Queen to b3, interesting. Not what I was expecting, I will say, but an interesting option. So I can trade the queens on b3. The problem with that is after I play it, I would have to do something about the a pawn being hit. If I play a6, they can always play the move b4 later, and I'm pretty much never going to get the c5 pawn break in, I will say. So I don't really know if I want to make this trade and kind of help white open up the rook and prevent my c5 move from happening. I'm actually leaning towards just castling here, quite honestly. If I castle, I think that is fine. If they trade queens, I'll take back with the knight, I suppose. If he takes on f6 first, I'll take back, and we'll play that kind of position. I do still want to play knight d7. I didn't play knight to d7 last move because they could play bishop takes g7, but even there, maybe in hindsight, I could have played rook g8. Something like that might have been available. But once again, I do want to get the bishop off of the c6 square and play the move c5. So queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, followed by c5 is also an option. And so that's another way of playing the position as well. We're down about 2 minutes, but I don't really think queen to b3 was the direction that white should be going, quite honestly. And so in that regard, I'm fine with the developments here at this point. So f3 is a little bit weakening. Queen b3 was a little bit odd in my opinion. Knight to d7 is one of my next two moves potentially. And then one day moving the bishop and trying to play c5. A little bit easier said than done. The bishop doesn't have a lot of great spaces to move to. But maybe I hit the bishop moves, I move the queen away, and then play bishop d5 afterwards or something like that is maybe an idea. So white is thinking. We were down more time on the clock, but now we're only down about a little over a minute. Minute and 20 seconds or so. Objectively, white's probably a little bit better off here, but I don't think it's very much. And I think our position is pretty solid. Once again, we really have no weaknesses in our position. This is one of the really nice things about the French defense in general. You might be a little bit cramped, you might be a little bit behind on space in a lot of positions, but you're going to have very few, if any, weaknesses to deal with. And, you know, we could work around that as the game goes on. Bishop to c2 is also kind of odd, in my opinion. Because I'm not really so sure what the game plan is there. If I don't take the queen, then I'm not really sure what the bishop's doing there. Maybe white wants to play c4 and then put the queen on d3 is maybe an idea. But what I could do here now is I could, again, I could hit the bishop. Bishop moves away, probably. And then maybe a move like bishop to b5. Stopping them from playing c4, stopping them from castling. And that might be a way of doing things as well. Maybe I hit the bishop moves, and then I even move the queen away as well. Still going for the bishop d5 idea. I don't think I can start with bishop b5. I think they might take my knight and then play bishop to e4. And then if I trade queens, I don't really have a good way to protect both the b7 and a7 pawns at the same time. That is kind of annoying. So I think I will start with knight d7 first. If white goes for the move c4, it looks like my queen is almost trapped, but I do have the a5 square available. If they trade the queens, I will take with the bishop, followed by pushing the pawn up to the c5 square. Most likely they will retreat the bishop away somewhere. And I might even be able to play e5 and open up the e-file since white's king is in the center. That could also be an available idea for us to consider. The current threat right now, of course, though, is to take the bishop. So most likely he's retreating. He does decide to trade. Interesting. So I am taking with the bishop. I don't want to take it with the pawn and block my bishop in. It doesn't seem very productive. Next, the plan is to take the bishop if he doesn't move. And if he does move, I am going for the c5 move in this position. Striking at the center. If white takes on c5, I will not take with the rook, because then the move bishop d6 would be quite bad, but I can take with the knight afterwards. And yeah, white will still have the pair of bishops in a relatively open position, but again, no weaknesses for us. We can start to mobilize our kingside pawn majority at the right time, and maybe even go for some kind of minority attack over on the queen side. So we're going to get into a pretty familiar or kind of common pawn structure, assuming that white takes on c5. If white doesn't take on c5, I'll take them on d4 and maybe make use of the pin on the c-file. Or if I can even isolate the d4 pawn, that would be a very nice situation for us as well. So I really think that white's going to take. I'll take back with the knight, and then we'll go from there. If white throws in bishop d6, I will probably play rook to d8, just kind of lying up a little bit towards that bishop. Rook to e8 would actually be a little bit awkward after bishop to a4 making the pin. That could be a little bit weird. But even there, I would have bishop to c6, so maybe it's really not that big of a deal. Rook on d8, though, does eye the bishop on d6 as well as the pawn if white makes that move. Okay, they end up castling. Does this give us the option of taking this pawn on a2? Probably they would play b3 afterwards. We take on d4. If they take back with the pawn, then we play bishop takes b3 and white loses another pawn because of the pin. If white plays rook takes d4, then my knight is attacked, and then king to b2 is coming to trap the bishop. So probably we're not, we can't really get away with taking that right now. What I can do, though, is I can either take the pawn, or I can actually just play a move like b5 and kind of just continue making some progress with my minority attack. I don't know if I really need to rush to capture if the rook is going to take back. There's really no need to help white double their rooks up. So I think I'll just go for b5, maybe b4, and go for minority attack over on the queenside part of the board. If they take me, I'll still take back with the knight. And maybe now that I've played the move b5, if I do take on a2 and they play b3, maybe I can play c4 or something like that. I think in hindsight I might have been able to do that right away, now that I'm thinking about it. If I take the pawn b3, then c4 might have worked here. Yeah, that might have actually worked. I'm not actually 100% sure. We can analyze it afterwards. Okay, I'm taking back with the knight. That was the game plan. Now I'm just going to play, probably here, just a5, I guess. I can also play rook to d8 first. Maybe rook to d8 is logical. If white tries to double up the rooks, if they go something like rook to d2, I have bishop takes a4 as an idea. Here I'm going to try to play b4 and kind of create some weaknesses and open up some lines on the queen side. And then in the long run, I can play f6, e5, and gain space on the king side. So I think my pieces are actually a bit more active than white's. White's bishop on g3 is shooting into thin air. This bishop isn't really aiming at anything that's a problem. My knight's active. Not entirely sure what rook to b5 or rook to e5 is going for. I do need to play pretty quickly here, though. I'm going to play f6 just to hit the rook. I don't see why not. And then we'll go g6 to attack the rook. And kind of just kick white's rook around. I'm not really so sure what the game plan for the rook is here. I can play e5 as well. I think I'll do that, just to keep the rook from doubling up on the d4 square. And then maybe we retreat the bishop, offer the trade of rooks, move my king up to g7, and keep everything well supported. And this rook on h4 just looks really silly. Really not sure what white's doing with this idea. Bishop to c4, and then even a bishop f1 idea is available. And if they play f4, I'll probably just play e4 and gain a pass pawn. Now now that I've played e5, though, I do need to watch out. Yeah, I'd be a little bit careful here. There is ideas of eliminating this knight and then going after. Here, let's go for this. Retreat the knight. He could have maybe taken the bishop and then played a move like bishop to b3, which could have been annoying. I need to play king g7 pretty soon just to get off of that diagonal. Again, if he moves the rook, he has to watch out that it's not undefended, because I could have a rook takes a2 idea. Like here, for example, I think now I can play bishop takes a2, because now the rook on d1 is unprotected. Oh, wait, I'm so sorry. I could have just taken on e4. Okay, that was a big miss. I saw the tactic, but I kind of just made a very bad version of it. I should have just taken the bishop. Okay, I'm still up the exchange, but played a little bit too quickly on that one. Okay, anyways, we all missed things. Rook d2, though, is my idea to attack on the second rank. There is no increment, so I need to just keep the speed going. I also need to watch out for bishop d5, so probably I'll go king g7 before I move the rook off of the d file. Rook to c4 is also an idea to pin the piece, to pin the bishop. Yeah, I'm gonna go rook c4 just to make it this annoying pin, and then f5 is an idea now. For instance, I'll go f5. Then I'll trade the rooks. Yeah, let's just trade. Let's go b4, I guess. Trade pawns. Check here and take the bishop. If he pins, I'll move the king up. Get away from the pin. Move the knight forward. I don't really care too much about that pawn. Let's take this. If he takes on h7, I'll take on h4. Now we're threatening to walk the king over to trap the bishop. Let's go there. Then I can put the rook behind the pawn to stop it from promoting. Okay, we'll take that, go behind, push this, take this, move over. Don't really care that the knight's been lost. Move the king up, push. Let's get the rook over. Just doing a little bit of zigzag here. Push the pawn, make the queen. Okay, I think we're pre-moving checkmate here. Okay, a little bit of Hikaru mouse speed there at the end. Finished with 0.9 seconds to his 2.7. But yeah, we got the win, got the job done. A little bit too close for comfort on the time element, but we were ahead the material at the end and got the job done. So yeah, interesting game. Opponent played a little bit of odd moves, but they had a solid position nonetheless. They had the bishop pair, a little bit more space. But I think we navigated the kind of the middle game and early in-game phase of the game nicely. So let's move over to the game review and we'll check it out there. All right, so in this game we played at an 84.5% accuracy to our opponent's 82.5. 4 inaccuracies and 2 mistakes to our opponent's 4 inaccuracies, 1 mistake, but they had a miss and a blunder. So that's how it went. So we'll check the game out and go through it. So e4, e6, d4, d5, knight to d2, trade the pawns, bishop d7 for our Fort Knox variation. And our opponent goes for this interesting move pawn to c3. If they had, let's say, castled instead, and then we play knight f6. If they take the knight, we take with the queen. The point here, in comparison to the game version of things where white played the move c3, is that if white tries the move bishop to g5, it looks like our queen is trapped at this point. The queen has nowhere to go. However, it would end up being a big blunder. We can now take the knight on f3, attack white's queen, that is protecting the bishop. If they take our bishop, we take their bishop, and then we're just up a piece. If white tries queen to d2 to protect the bishop, here we can get away with taking the pawn on d4. And white does not have this move bishop to b5 because it's not a check. This is a big reason as to why we put the knight on d7 before we play knight f6. Now it's no longer a check. Here we would just trade the queens, save our bishop, and then we're just up, we're just up a piece. Now when white plays the move pawn to c3, interestingly enough, we can no longer recapture on f6 with the queen, because after bishop g5, if we take the knight, they play queen to d2 to guard the bishop, and we can no longer take the pawn on d4 this time. And now our queen is actually just legitimately trapped here. So that would be bad news for us. So for that reason, we have to recapture with the knight in this case. Now, there's also a lot of little tactics that white has to watch out for here. Let's say, for example, white castles the king, which is a very common move. There's a couple of options that are available. You can go for bishop takes knight, followed by queen to d5, and try to play this kind of equal type of endgame. Somewhat similar to the bishop pair versus bishop and knight combo that we had in the game anyways. But you can also play something like bishop to d6, which is another way of playing. If white plays a move like knight to e5 now, this is a mistake because you can trade bishop for knight. Then play this nice move, queen to d5, threatening the pawn, threatening mate, and here white just ends up losing material. If they play f3, you can simply take the pawn on e5 if you want to. There's other moves that also work, but all things considered, you are just up a pawn with a better position here as black, if white jumps the knight in too quickly. Now, in the game, white played bishop f4, which is one of the more tricky moves to combat, mainly because now if we simply play a move like bishop e7, and then white castles, we castle, and they play knight e5, part of the difference here is there's none of this queen to d5 or bishop takes knight on e5 type of ideas, and here our bishop is hit and we get kicked around a little bit, maybe we can still go to the e4 square. I guess white could play rook e1 first or something like that. Ultimately, part of the issue we run into is that our bishop on c6 doesn't have a lot of great squares to move to. My plan at this point would probably be to play the move b6, and then bishop to b7, and try to play c5. I did mention during the game that this is a big part of playing this position, is this pawn break we want to go for. And the computer gives a slight nod to white here, mainly because of their having a little bit more space, but it's a back and forth position. I think this would be fine for black to play. Okay, our opponent played bishop f4 though. I went for bishop d6, offering the trade. Knight to e5 was a good response. And here I do not want to take the pawn on g2, because after rook to g1, white is going to take the pawn on g7 afterwards. And I think it's... both kings are a little bit weaker, but white's pieces are a little more active, I would say. I would be more worried in black's shoes here, because white's rook is far into our half of the board, and the f7 pawn is a target. So instead, I decided to eliminate the knight. White recaptured with the bishop, which is the better move. If they do take with the pawn, we can play knight h5, and then white faces a bit of a tricky position here. It's hard to guard the bishop and the pawn. We don't even necessarily have to rush for the pawn. We can do stuff like queen to d5, attacking both pawns, and white's in trouble here because they're going to lose one of these two. Even if we lose the knight on h5, we're getting the bishop on d3. And this is also why knight h5 worked in the first place. If they take the knight on h5, we get the bishop on d3. And here white's not going to get to castle, and our light square attack is very dangerous here. So instead, though, he took with the bishop, which was the better move. I decided to play queen to d5. Not the best move in the position, but my idea was that I kind of wanted to provoke white to play the move f3, which they did correctly play. I guess castling is probably also fine to go for here. Then you can play knight d7, chase the bishop. Maybe white's a little bit better, but black is solid nonetheless in these situations. The computer says the best move is h5, but I mean, I don't really think I would have considered h5 at all during the game, even though I guess the idea is to play knight g4, but looks pretty weird to me. Anyways, though, I went queen d5, f3, rook to c8. Maybe not the best move. Apparently castling queenside is a bit better, but I think if we castle queenside, we're never going to play c5, so I don't know if that's the way I would want to handle the position personally. But yeah, white is better here, but then they played this weird move queen to b3, which I thought was pretty awkward during the game. I didn't really want to rush to make the capture. I decided to castle first, and then went for knight to d7. And then once we were able to get in the c5 pawn break, I think black is having a totally fine position at this point. And we saw that I was able to kind of just slowly but surely outmaneuver and outplay my opponent as the game went on. They castled. I thought about bishop takes a2, but I thought b3. I guess in hindsight I did mention c4 during the game. c4 would allow me to get my bishop out, and if they play b4, we can go bishop to b3, and black is doing okay at this point. Even if you lose the pawn on b3, you can put the knight on the c4 square and have a really nice looking knight, I would say. Anyways, though, none of this happened. I went for b5, and then took back with the knight. Got the rook on the open file. Played a5. And white started to play some kind of awkward stuff here. Rook e5 was weird. Rook h5 does attack h7, but the rook ended up on the h4 square, which was kind of odd to me. I went for e5. And you can see here that white has already pretty much lost their advantage for the most part. He did play bishop f2. I played knight e6. I did completely miss the fact that bishop to b6 attacking the rook and the pawn is available. Quite honestly, just missed that idea. Would have been better to maybe play king g7 or something else instead. But then white made a huge blunder with bishop to e4, and I kind of played a little bit too quickly here. Bishop e4 does leave the rook on d1 undefended, so I was mentioning at various moments, like if white plays rook to d2, I can play bishop takes a2 check, and then win the rook on d2. Bishop to e4 undefends the rook in a different way, and it would have obviously been much better to just take the bishop and then take the rook because white is in check. This would have won the game right on the spot. I rushed bishop a2 a little bit. I also didn't have a ton of time on the clock. Still came out ahead the exchange, attacked the piece, traded stuff, won another piece, and won the game without really much trouble from here. We trapped the bishop in the corner and eventually got the job done. Had to play very, very quickly here. Definitely not playing the best and most precise moves here, no question about it. Eventually got promoted though, and was able to organize the kind of ladder or staircase checkmate with 0.9 seconds on the clock, a bit close for comfort, but we got the job done and got the win. So definitely a tense game. That'll do it for this first one though. Let's go ahead and get into our second game. All right, we've got game number 2 here of our French defense kind of video and repertoire that we'll be playing. E4, E6, D4, D5. Our opponent goes for knight to D2. We're actually seeing a very, very similar setup to the very first game. Let's trade the pawns. Player, little Fort Knox maneuver that we are all familiar with here. Most likely knight F3 is coming. We'll go bishop C6 afterwards. Bishop D3 is another option. Pawn to C3 is another option. All these moves tend to kind of transpose into one another. We will... Okay, so this opponent goes for castling instead of the move pawn to C3. So the difference in this particular case is that we can go for the move knight F6, and if they take, we do not have to recapture with the knight. We can now play the move queen takes F6. This is the big important point. If bishop to G5, we take on F3, and we are in good shape there. Most likely white needs to do something about the knight on F3. They can play a move like bishop to E2 instead. But if they play bishop to E2, then we can always throw in the move H6 and pretty much eliminate the threat of playing bishop to G5. Also, if the bishop is on the E2 square, white's not really threatening to trap us, because then the F5 and G6 squares are available. So we might not even necessarily need to play H6. We could maybe even also just go for bishop D6. But our main threat right now is to simply capture the knight and mess up white's pawn structure, and maybe even win the pawn on D4, depending on how white recaptures on F3. So bishop to E2, I think, is almost mandatory at this point, if white doesn't want to lose the D4 pawn, or to worsen their pawn structure. C3 is also available, but we would still take on F3 and mess up the pawns. So after bishop to E2, I think... Yeah, so he does go bishop to E2. So the question is, do we need to throw in the move H6 or not? I don't think it's a bad move to throw in, because it's not like white can really punish it in any way. If we go bishop D6, white goes bishop G5, we go queen to G6. If they try to attack us again, then we can still play bishop takes F3. Take on F3 and hit the queen and get rid of the bishop. That might be absolutely fine to go for, quite honestly. Bishop D6, bishop G5, queen G6. Threaten to take the knight, maybe the bishop retreats, or white defends the bishop or something like that. I think we would be doing fine there, but I also don't really see any drawback to playing H6 at the same time. If we go H6, maybe white plays C4, hoping to play some kind of D5 move to trap our bishop. That could be a little bit annoying. H6 does allow us to castle queenside, I will say, because then there's no skewer. Whereas if we go bishop D6, we cannot castle queenside afterwards, because there would still be a skewer. So honestly, I'm not sure if one is better than the other. At least if it is, it's not going to be by very much. I'm kind of leaning towards bishop D6 just because I generally want to prioritize development. But again, I don't really think there's a... I'm going to go for H6. I'm going to do this one. We'll check in the game review afterwards if it makes that much of a difference. White does go for C3. Now I will go for bishop D6. And probably given the circumstance, I actually want to castle queenside and play some kind of G5, G4 pawn storm. That actually looks like it could be very strong. Our bishops are both lined up in that direction. This knight can't move forward easily. He does play B4. Okay, so as soon as I say that, now after the move B4, now I'm actually a little less inclined to castle queenside, because there's no need to give my opponent, you know, the ability to kick my bishop around so easily. So how do I want to react here? So if I do castle queenside, B5, bishop to e4. If bishop d5, they play c4, and I feel like that's... I don't know. That doesn't feel so helpful for me to encourage them to push the pawn further. So castle, hit, move. They can play knight to d2, attacking the bishop. Then the bishop has to go back on this diagonal somewhere else, which is kind of awkward. I could also just play a move like knight to b6. I can't play e5 because they'll play d5 and trap the bishop. This b4 move is kind of annoying, I will say. Knight b6. If c4, I can take on b4. I think that's fine. If knight b6 and a4, that's kind of annoying. Could also just play b6, and then if we get hit, we just move the bishop back to b7. That also actually looks pretty solid, I will say. And then later we can play c6 or c5 to strike at the center. You know what, I think I'm going to go for that option. I don't necessarily know if this is best, but I don't want to burn too much more time on the position. I'm going to go b6 to give myself an escape square. He's going for a4. I think he's under the assumption I'm castling queenside. Now that I've played b6, I have no intention of castling queenside. He might want to play a5 and then a6 and chase the bishop around more. Maybe with that in mind, I will actually go now for a5. He'll probably play b5, I assume, and then I'll drop the bishop backwards. And then later I'll play c6 or c5 to strike at the center. That's still kind of the game plan, I would say. And if we can open up the c-file, we can open up pressure towards the pawn on c6, which is a bit of a liability. We can also play pawn to e5 at the right time to strike at the center. White is going to have a little bit of a hard time, I think, working against these e5 and c6 pawn breaks, or these e5 and c5 pawn breaks. And I think that's going to be... I think that's going to end up being fine for us. Even though white is going to have more space than us, especially after all these pawns move forward, they're going to leave some weaknesses kind of in the pawn's wake, you could call it. With great space comes great responsibility in a lot of situations. And so even though white's going to have more space, they're going to have to also protect those pawns that are giving them more space at the same time. So I'm going to castle. And then I am going to play probably a combination of rook to d8 and then pawn to c5. That's kind of what I'm leaning towards here. If I go pawn to c5 right now, white takes on c5, and then I have two pieces lined up towards one another on the file. If I go e5, they still go c5. Maybe not, though. Actually, maybe e5 is actually really good. Because if I can gain control of the c5 square, that's pretty good for me. So e5, c5, pawn takes, knight takes. That's fine for me. I'm not losing any material. e5, pawn takes, knight takes, queen takes. I threaten mate, and I control the c5 square. I think e5 might actually be pretty good. I think that this works. I think that this idea works here. And if white moves the pawn forward to d5, then I can put a piece on c5, maybe knight to c5, and maneuver the bishop away from the... get it out from behind the d5 pawn that it's kind of being blocked by. Okay, I'm taking with the knight here. And now it feels like the knight on c5, or the c5 square is weak. I take with the queen. I think this was my idea, right? Threaten checkmate. He's going to play g3, I assume. And then I can play something like rook to d8, and... I think we're doing totally fine here. I do think he's... Actually, hold on. No, I'm not going to play rook to d8. I'm going to play queen e4. Queen e4 threatens checkmate on two different squares. And there's no way to protect this. If he moves the pawn to f3, I will take the bishop on e3 with check. And he can't block with the bishop because I'll just take the bishop. So I think we just win the game here on the spot. There's no good way to stop the mate without giving up the protection of the bishop or losing a piece. So I think here white just kind of got overambitious on the queen side and ended up not really getting the pawns moving in the way that they wanted to. Even if I didn't have this attack on the king side, I've already frozen the pawns. The pawn can't go to c5 anytime soon. My bishop on b7 ends up being a huge asset. And yeah, he ends up just resigning here. We get the win in 18 moves, playing playing the 4-Knox variation of the French defense once again. A lot of people think of the 4-Knox variation as being like super solid and, oh, you're just trying to play for a draw or something like that. But you can also have pretty quick knockouts if white makes mistakes, as we're seeing here in this case. So yeah, pretty happy about this one. Let's go ahead and move over to the game review area and check it out there. All right, so we have the game review here. Played at a 98.7% accuracy, which is really nice. Pretty much no mistakes, errors, blunders, anything like that. So let's check the game out. So we have the same Fort Knox variation that we had in the first game. The main difference in this one is that our opponent castles instead of playing that bishop to f4 move. Or the c3 move, sorry. They played c3 in the first game. And then they played bishop f4 a few moves later after that. So when they castle, the main difference here is we can take with the queen, because if white tries the same bishop g5 move that was a problem in the first game when the pawn was on c3, as mentioned previously, we can take the knight, you know, if they try to keep the bishop protected, here we take the d4 pawn, and we're just up a pawn with a much better position here. So this would be very bad for black, or sorry, very bad for white. I think he thought here, he ended up thinking for about, a little over a minute, about a minute and 20 seconds or so, and I think he was looking at bishop to g5, but kind of realized it didn't work. So he played bishop e2 instead. The computer has a bit of a preference for the bishop to d6 move here. I did mention that during the game. It's not much of a difference. h6 is also fine to play. He played c3, we got the bishop to d6, played b4, ended up playing b6 to give the bishop a little bit of an escape square. And we can already see here that the computer's already liking our position as black a little bit more, which might seem kind of odd considering that we are behind on space, but we have no weaknesses in the position. White's pawns can potentially become targets for these pawn breaks that we saw happen in the game. And we're also a bit better developed at the same time. We have all 3 minor pieces and our queen. White has 2 minor pieces and no queen. And we can castle pretty easily here. So he played a4. I did play a5, which was a good decision. Brought the bishop backwards, castled. And then, yeah, I'm pretty happy to see that the move e5 striking at the d4 pawn is the best move in the position. And yeah, it's simply put a better position for black all of a sudden, because once again, even though white has more space, they're also creating weaknesses with that space, with all those pawns that they're pushing. For example, if they play the move d5, they shut the bishop on b7 out, but now we have the square on c5 that's good for us. We could maybe play bishop to c5 at the right time, or queen to e7 and then bishop c5, something like that. And this bishop on b7 can always maneuver in a different direction. We'll move the knight away, play bishop c8, bring the bishop over towards the king side, and then the bishop's not really blocked in anymore. If they take the pawn as they did in the game, we saw that kind of ended up being a mistake, and we have a pretty strong position here all of a sudden. They could decide to not touch the d4 pawn at all, but then I would have taken the pawn on d4, move the queen away somewhere, I don't know, queen e7, and we still have very good control over the c5 square. Put the rooks in the center of the board, put a piece on the c5 square. The pawn on a4 is potentially a target because our knight on c5 will hit it. And black is actually just having 0 weaknesses in a better position once again. So in the game, white took the pawn, which was a mistake. Take with the knight. Now our queen is threatening to checkmate on h2. g3 is one of the only ways really to stop that. If he plays f4, we'll take the bishop right away. And then after g3, I'm glad I didn't really rush to make a quick move here, but my first instinct, quite honestly, was to play just rook to d8 and line up towards the queen. But then I did realize that queen to e4 is much, much better, and the game is pretty much over. There's no way to stop the checkmate without losing some kind of material. If they push the pawn, they lose the bishop, and if they block with the bishop, we just take the bishop, and we are up a piece. So yeah, 2 different Fort Knox variation games here with our French defense, 2 different wins, and we'll move on to our 3rd game now. All right, game number 3 here. Let's see what variation against our French defense our opponent decides to go for. Okay, d4, d5. Will we see another knight c3 or knight d2 Tarrasch? We do not. Okay, our opponent goes for the advanced variation instead. We're going to go for the move pawn to c5. Striking at the center. They do play the move c3 to reinforce the center, which is the best move in the position, generally speaking. Here I'm going to go for the move queen to b6. And the plan here is to maneuver the bishop to the b5 square and look to exchange off our bad bishop. So white decides to go for the move pawn to a3. We could go for the move pawn to a5 to discourage any kind of b4 type of stuff. I think we will go for that here. Let's play a5. They might have wanted to take on c5 and then play b4 or something like that at the right time, but we're going to discourage that from happening. Next, we'll play bishop to b5 and take it from there. Bishop to e2. Okay, we'll just go bishop to b5 to exchange our pair of bishops. They could play queen to b3 now that I'm looking at that. I guess we have pawn to c4. That is not ideal, I will say. So maybe in hindsight, queen to b3 could be a bit problematic here. Little bit awkward, I will say. I played this a little quick. Yeah, they do go for queen to b3. Interesting. So the downside in some regards of playing a5 is that now our queen is unprotected, and this pin on the b file becomes a little bit of a problem here. Now we're not losing material because we do have the move pawn to c4, but we are having to shut our bishop in, which is not a ideal situation. I think in hindsight, I should probably play the move a4 first and then play bishop to b5 afterwards. Okay, so that's something to learn from here. Quite honestly, I don't think I've seen anybody play this a3 queen b3 combination. I think we have to play c4. There's no way to protect the bishop otherwise. So I think we have to do this. It's not ideal. Now, we're going to have an interesting pawn structure where we don't really have any pressure on the back parts of the chain. c3 and d4 will have no pressure on them. But we can still play the move f6 at the right time in the near future. And that's how we are going to... that's kind of our next pawn break option to get pressure on white's center. Now, the question is, what do we do about the pieces? I think here, I am going to try to play f6 sooner rather than later. And I think I'll do something like knight to d7, f6, and then maneuver the knight around to g6 or c6 to attack the e5 pawn more. I think that's going to be my game plan. So let's go knight d7. Knight c6 might have also been fine, but I kind of want to leave the c6 square open for the other knight if I can. So do I go f6 right away? Feels like it could be a bit iffy. I think I'll play knight e7 first. I'm going to play f6 pretty soon, though. Like f6 and then knight g6 or something along those lines. White's pieces are not really set up for, like, let's say if I play f6 now, which is what I'm leaning towards for sure. They're not really set up, like, if they take our pawn, we take back. They're not really prepared to attack our slightly weak pawn on e6 all that easily. So I think I will play f6 right away. And if they take, I'm most likely going to take back with the pawn, mainly because I don't want to give the e5 square over as a weakness in my position, and also because I now get the half-open g file that can be useful at the right time. Now, in terms of king kind of castling direction, I am definitely going to be castling queenside, because we are able to kind of close up the queenside here, so it's very, it's going to be harder for my opponent to attack me on that side of the board. If I castle kingside, it feels like we would just be asking for trouble with the open space there. I think my opponent wants to play f4 or bishop h5. Bishop h5 would be rather annoying, so I think I'm going to castle first here. If they play f4, I very well might play e5 and just completely blast the position open very quickly. e5 is the pawn break I want to play towards next. And I think I'm going to... Let's see. If I play e5 and he goes bishop e3, that is a little bit annoying, I will say. I really want the knight on g6. Knight on g6 and then e5 looks really good, but knight on g6, I think I just end up losing a pawn, which is not great. e5, bishop e3 lining up towards my queen, but then I think I can... I could also try rook g8 and then knight g6, but rook g8 loses the pawn on h7. which is a bit annoying, of course. But then maybe there's like f5 and some kind of queen trap. Like, white has to be a little bit careful about their queen, I will say. Not easy to lock it in, though, I will say at the same time. Okay, so probably not rook g8. Maybe I do just go for e5. It's kind of what I'm leaning towards here. h5 would also be useful. h5 would get the pawn off of h7, and it would also stop white from playing a move like bishop to g4, which could be rather annoying at the right moment. They're going to play knight to d2 next move, almost guaranteed. So another option is to play knight to c6, and then play e5, and then that way white would pretty much have to trade the pawns. And I think we would be in totally fine shape there. The slight drawback of e5 is we do give over the h4 square, though. So in some ways, I'd really like to get rid of this knight before I play e5, but I do think that's a lot easier said than done. That is a lot easier said than done. I could even consider sacrificing the pawn here, getting the open h file, playing bishop to d6, and trying to attack towards the h2 pawn. That doesn't look all that crazy, quite honestly. That could be interesting. I actually don't mind the look of that. I am not really ahead on development, but I can attack the queen on g6 a bunch of times. Maybe I will do this. I don't think this is necessarily the best move, but it does look interesting. It does look like an interesting pawn sacrifice. I'm trying to trade off this knight, which is kind of clogging up the king, the king side. I'm also going to trade off this bishop. So I'm going to go bishop d6 here. Yeah, so bishop d6. If he takes my bishop, I might actually throw in the move rook to g8 first before recapturing it. And then I think it could be a very scary position for white. Bishop take. If I take with the queen right away, there is queen to g3, which is a little bit annoying. But if I throw in rook here first, if bishop c5, there is queen to c7, and I don't see a way to stop checkmate and save the queen at the same time. Or I can take the knight, take the bishop, and then queen to c7. So I think I'm actually going to throw this in, and I think white's in a tough spot. If the queen moves away somewhere, I will take the pawn and threaten checkmate. And then I will move my knight and my bishop over towards the king side, and I'm down a pawn, but you know, when you have these opposite side castling positions, the best thing you can go for is like sacrificing a pawn, opening up lines for your rooks, opening up the activity of your pieces. My bishop on b5 is not amazing by any stretch of the imagination. Ooh, I don't think this works. So do I take the bishop or do I just go queen c7? I think I just go queen c7, honestly, because I'm threatening the queen and I'm threatening checkmate. And there's no way to guard both. The queen would pretty much have to sacrifice itself for the rook, and then that would be very bad for white. Also, if I go queen c7, even the bishop on c5 might get trapped at some point, which would be very good for me. So, yeah, we're going to do this. Threatening the queen, but also threatening checkmate on h2. He can take the rook. Oh, okay. Well, if he's going to do that, we just get the checkmate. Okay. Pretty quick knockout win here. This one took only 19 moves. I think our other game was 18, I think. Maybe even less. So, yeah, some quick knockout wins with the French defense. Nice to see it in this couple of games here. Let's go over to our game review, though, and we'll see what white could have done a bit better, because I also don't think I played the opening great where I allowed this queen b3 pin. So we'll check it out in the game review. All right, so in the game review here, we played at an 87.7% accuracy. 2 mistakes and 2 misses. Curious what the misses were. But we did get the job done. So let's check it out here. So e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, c3, queen b6. This is all pretty standard stuff. a3, I did go for a5, bishop to e2, and yeah, apparently the bishop e5 move is not that great. But it's not because of queen b3 necessarily. What white should play is apparently trade the bishops, and then the move a4 specifically, and then castle. But I don't really mind these kind of positions, quite honestly. I don't mind doing something like knight to c6, take on d4 at the right time, give white the d4 weakness, maneuver the knight to f5. We have a good bishop, white has a bad bishop. The computer slightly prefers white here, mainly because they do have the b5 square that they can use, but I don't think that's the biggest deal in the world, and I would be fine playing black here, quite honestly. So it wasn't I think the mistake here is a little harsh, quite honestly, but it wasn't because of queen to b3. We do have to play c4, but then this position is not so bad for black. Apparently we should play a4, though. A4 just to completely close up the queen side. I guess if we don't play a4, apparently white's best way to play is for them to play a4, and then they might be able to play pawn to b3 later on to create some counterplay. So maybe this is what would have been an improvement on our end. Play a4, completely close up the queen side, but then you do want to work towards f6 or f5 or something over on the king side direction. Most of the gameplay is not going to revolve around the queen side anymore, but it is white who's always going to have to be a little bit stuck protecting the b2 pawn, because we're going to keep the queen on b6 for a while and keep eyeing it. So white is a tiny bit better here, but if they play a4 in this position, that like they should have, then they'd be maybe a little bit of a larger advantage. And here, once again, I should still be playing a4 myself. So kind of a comedy of errors back and forth here, you could say. He should play a4, I should play a4. Once again, he should play a4. He gets a miss because he didn't play it. I'm going to get another miss because I didn't play a4. And clearly neither one of us were thinking about the move a4 here. So I don't know what to say in that regard. Pretty funny that we're going to both have a bunch of misses in a row. Once again, he should play a4 once more. I do castle queenside this time. Again, he should play a4. And okay, I'm very, very happy here to see that knight to g6 was the best move. I really wasn't so sure about this during the game, but it ends up being a very strong pawn sacrifice. And apparently white should not take the pawn because bishop d6 is very strong, and then rook to g8 with this nice intermezzo or in-between move is very strong. And white is actually in pretty bad shape here. Even if the queen moves back to safety, we take the bishop, we threaten checkmate. They might play g3 to defend. Then we can play stuff like f5, f4, move the knight over towards the king side. And yeah, I think white's actually just in a lot of trouble here. This pressure on the king side is very, very dangerous. And black has a very nice position. White has 0 attack on our king on c8. We have a very big attack towards white's king on h1. And yeah, this is really good news for us in black shoes. So in the game, though, he played bishop c5, which was a big mistake. Went to c7. Once again, he can't defend the queen and defend checkmate simultaneously. He saved the queen, but he got himself checkmated. And yeah, we got a very nice win here with this one. So 3 nice games here, played against players all above the rating of 2100 on chess.com, a couple of them over 2200. And so hopefully you enjoyed this video and these couple of instructive rapid games. If you are interested in learning this repertoire a bit more, the various ways that I recommend playing the French defense, as I mentioned at the start of the video, there is an ongoing sale at chessable.com right now where you can check out my French defense course, which will be linked in the description below the video. It is on sale for the rest of the year for their Christmas sale, so if you want to check it out, it's pretty much your best time to check it out since you get to get a nice discount, which is always good. So anyways, though, that'll do it for me. Hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you around the next one. Have a good day.